The gun was already in her hand when Levi Haskins stepped through the door of the Half Moon Saloon, and the look on his face told her everything she had been terrified to know. He had found out. Nora Yates stood at the far end of the bar, her fingers wrapped around the handle of the small revolver she had kept hidden in the lining of her traveling coat for the past 4 months, and she watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his dark eyes moved from her face to the gun and back again. And she thought, this is it. This is the moment that breaks everything open. "Put it down, Nora," he said, and his voice was the same voice that had read scripture to her by firelight, the same voice that had laughed at her terrible cooking, the same voice that had whispered her name into the dark of his front porch while they sat watching stars they could not name, and the sound of it now, clipped and controlled and deliberately empty, was the worst thing she had ever heard in her life. "You know," she said. "It was not a question. I know." He took one slow step forward. The saloon had gone utterly silent. Hank Brewster was still behind the bar, frozen with a dirty rag in his fist. 2 cowboys at the corner table had gone stone still. "I know who you are, and I know why you came to Redemption Creek, and I know that nothing you told me in the last 4 months was the full truth." Her chest cracked open like dry earth after a long drought. She had let him think she was brave. She had stood in the middle of every hard thing this territory threw at her, and she had not flinched, not visibly, not where he could see, because she needed him to see a woman who could handle herself. She had let him believe that the steadiness in her eyes was fearlessness, when in truth it was the locked and bolted door of a woman who had learned that showing fear was the same as offering yourself as a target. And he had let her think he was not lonely. He had kept his ranch running, and his mouth occupied with practical things, had filled the silence between them with tasks and jokes, and the careful, considered words of a man who had decided long ago that needing someone was a luxury he could not afford. He had let her believe he was content alone, that her presence was a convenient arrangement rather than the one thing in 4 months that had made the nights in Redemption Creek feel survivable. But that was the story they would have to unravel together if she could lower the gun, if he could uncross the terrible distance between them, if the secrets they had each been hoarding like winter stores could finally be opened and accounted for. Neither of those things happened yet. She kept the gun up. He kept walking toward her. And the half-frozen saloon held its breath, while the 2 most carefully guarded people in Redemption Creek stared at each other across all the careful lies that had, without either of them intending it, become the architecture of something they were both terrified to lose. It had started, as most dangerous things in the Arizona territory did, with a letter. The year was 1882, and the town of Redemption Creek sat in the dry red throat of a canyon that the Santa Cruz River occasionally remembered to visit. It was not a beautiful town, and it did not pretend to be. It had a main street with enough buildings to suggest permanence, a livery stable, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who remembered everything she was ever told and deployed that information with surgical precision, a small post office operating out of the front room of the postmaster's house, a church that leaned slightly to the left and had never been properly explained, and the Half Moon Saloon, which was the kind of establishment that the church felt personally responsible for. Levi Haskins had been in Redemption Creek for 6 years, long enough to be considered a fixture, not long enough for anyone to have stopped wondering about him. He was 32 years old, lean and brown from years of working under a sun that did not negotiate, with dark hair that was always slightly too long, and hands that were always slightly too scarred for the gentle way he sometimes used them. He ran cattle on 400 acres of land northeast of town, did so with the assistance of 2 hired hands named Old Pete and a younger man everyone called Cisco, who was approximately 20 years old and relentlessly cheerful, and he did so with a level of competence that other ranchers respected, and a level of solitude that those same ranchers occasionally found troubling. He had not come to Arizona from anywhere he wanted to discuss. That was the essential fact about Levi Haskins. He was a man who had arrived in Redemption Creek carrying something heavy and had set it down somewhere in the red dust and built a life over the top of it, and he was perfectly satisfied to let the ground cover everything that he had buried. He had written the advertisement on a Tuesday in November, when the cold had pushed down from the mountains, and the ranch house had felt particularly and mercilessly large. He had not written it out of hope exactly. He had written it out of practicality, or so he told himself, or so he told old Pete when Pete found the draft and raised an eyebrow. He needed help managing the household accounts, which were a disaster. He needed someone who could cook something other than beef and biscuits, because Cisco had been making beef and biscuits for 11 months and Levi had begun to have feelings about it that were not entirely rational but were entirely real. He needed a helpmate, a partner in the business of running a ranch, a sensible arrangement between two capable adults. He had sent the advertisement to a paper in St. Louis, Missouri. He had not expected anyone to answer it. Nora Yates had answered it on a Wednesday in December, in a boarding house room in St. Louis, Missouri, while sitting on a narrow bed with her coat still on because she had not been able to afford enough firewood that week, and she had answered it not because she wanted a husband in Arizona but because she needed to disappear. She was 26 years old. She was a bookkeeper by training, having learned the trade from her father, who had been a good man and a meticulous accountant, and who had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving her precisely enough money to survive for 8 months and precisely enough grief to last considerably longer. She had dark auburn hair that was always pulling itself loose from wherever she pinned it, and green eyes that people often described as sharp, before they described them as anything warmer. And she had spent the last 2 years working for a bank in St. Louis that had recently come under the management of a man named Gerald Holt. Gerald Holt was the kind of man who believed that certain things were owed to him by certain people. And when Nora had discovered that he had been systematically falsifying the bank's deposit records to cover transfers of other people's money into accounts that Gerald Holt controlled, she had made the catastrophically naive decision to document what she found and present it to the bank's board of directors. The board of directors had thanked her for her concern and told Gerald Holt everything she had said before the day was out. Gerald Holt had resources. Gerald Holt had friends in positions that made her uncomfortable. Gerald Holt had made it quietly and thoroughly clear through intermediaries that Nora Yates was a woman who would benefit from reconsidering her choices, her location, and potentially her name. She had reconsidered all three. She had answered the advertisement in the St. Louis paper. She had written a letter to a man she had never met in a town she had never heard of, and she had presented herself as a woman who was practical and capable and interested in the work of Frontier Partnership, all of which was true, and she had not mentioned Gerald Holt or the falsified records or the very particular fear that had been sleeping in her stomach for the last 6 weeks, because none of that was information she intended to share with a stranger in Arizona. She had brought the small revolver with her. It had belonged to her father. Levi Haskins had met her stage at the Redemption Creek Depot on a cold February afternoon in 1882, and the first thing she had done when she stepped off the stage was scan the street in both directions before her eyes found him, which he had noticed and filed away without comment. The second thing she had done was offer her hand to shake like she was completing a business transaction, which he had found both unusual and clarifying. "Levi Haskins," he had said. "Nora Yates," she had said, and then she had looked him directly in the eye and said, "I understand we should discuss the terms of this arrangement before anything becomes official." And he had said, "Yes, I suppose we should." And she had said, "Good, because I have several questions." And he had said, "I imagine you do." And they had walked to the diner next to the general store and sat across a table from each other for 2 hours. And by the end of those 2 hours, Levi Haskins had agreed to a 3-month trial period during which she would keep the ranch accounts and assist with household management, and occupy the small bedroom at the end of the hall, and she had agreed to the same terms. And they had shaken hands again, and the arrangement had begun. What neither of them had accounted for was the fact that they would actually like each other. Not immediately. The first 2 weeks were careful and professional and mildly awkward in the way of two private people unexpectedly sharing close quarters. Nora organized the ranch accounts in 4 days, which represented an achievement roughly equivalent to clearing a forest with a pocket knife given the state they were in. And Levi had looked at the ledgers she handed him and then looked at her and said, "How in the hell did you do this so fast?" And she had said, "I'm very good at numbers." And he had said, "I can see that." And something had shifted slightly, like a stone that had been in one position for a long time finding a small new groove. She started cooking on the 5th day, and the food was not remarkable, but it was not beef and biscuits, and Cisco looked at his plate the first night and appeared to experience something close to a religious event. Old Pete said it was the best meal he had eaten in 3 years. Levi said it was very good, and he said it with a quietness that was different from politeness, and Nora had looked at him and thought, "He means that," and had felt something small and warm open briefly in her chest before she closed it again. She was not here to feel things. She was here to be safe. She was here to be invisible enough that Gerald Holt's reach could not find her in the red dust of the Arizona Territory. But the Territory had other ideas about her plans, as the Territory tended to do. The cattle got into Mrs. Calloway's feed garden on the 3rd Saturday, and Nora was the only one near enough to deal with it. And she had dealt with it by walking directly into the middle of the herd without a second thought, and moving them out with the practiced calm of someone who had definitely not spent the previous 15 years in an accounting office. And Levi had ridden up to find the cattle already moving, and Nora walking behind them like she had been doing this her entire life. And she had looked up at him and said, "I grew up near my uncle's farm," which was partially true, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Mrs. Calloway is going to want compensation," and she had said, "I know, I'll take it from the discretionary account," and he had said, "I didn't know there was a discretionary account," and she had said, "There is now." And he had started to say something else, but instead he had laughed, and it was a real laugh, unexpected, loosened from somewhere it had clearly been kept for a while, and Nora Yates had told herself that sound was nothing to her, and had believed herself approximately not at all. By the end of March, they had established a rhythm. She rode out with him twice a week to check the fence lines because she had asked to, because being useful to the ranch meant being valued by the ranch, and being valued meant stability, and stability was the thing she was building here carefully, one day at a time. She learned the land. She learned the names of the ranches that bordered his, the names of the families that ran them, the complicated social geography of a small town where everyone's business was theoretically everyone else's business, but was in practice protected by a deeply held frontier ethic that said you didn't ask what you weren't offered. She learned Levi. She learned that he woke before dawn every single morning and sat on the front porch with coffee for exactly 30 minutes before he started work, and that if she came out during those 30 minutes, he made room for her without comment, and that the silence they shared in those pre-dawn hours was the most comfortable silence she had experienced since her father died. She learned that he was patient with Cisco in a way that went beyond the patience of an employer, that he had quietly paid for Cisco to see the doctor in Tucson last November when the boy had a chest sickness, that he had never once mentioned this to anyone, and would have been visibly discomfited to know she had found the receipt in the accounts. She learned that he read, and read seriously, keeping a small shelf of books above the fireplace that included a battered copy of David Copperfield, a guide to cattle breeding that had been read so many times the spine had separated, and a book of poetry by Walt Whitman that he would clearly have preferred she not notice. She asked him about the Whitman one evening in late March, And he had said, "A man I knew gave it to me." And the way he said it closed the subject as effectively as a bolted door, and she did not push, because she understood bolted doors from the inside. She learned that he was lonely in the way that people who have decided not to be lonely are lonely, which is a specific and particularly deep kind of loneliness because it is coupled with the refusal to acknowledge it. He had built a life that was full of things, work and land and animals and a small community and two men who depended on him, and he had filled every hour with the substance of purpose. And if there were moments at the end of the day when the ranch house settled and the space in it felt larger than it should have, well, a man did not need to say so. He never said so. He was exceedingly careful never to say so. She let him have that. She let him think she believed it, because it seemed to be what he needed, and because the alternative was to see it and name it. And naming it would have required a conversation about wanting and loneliness that she was not prepared to have without first confessing why she was here, and she was not prepared to do that. She was afraid. She let him think she wasn't. She had made that decision on her second week in Redemption Creek, when a letter had arrived from St. Louis, not from Gerald Holt directly, nothing so obvious, but from a woman named Clara, a friend from the boarding house. And the letter had said in careful, coded language that a man had come asking questions about a woman of Nora's description, and that he had offered money for information about her whereabouts, and that Clara had said she knew nothing, but that others in the house might be less reliable. Nora had read that letter by the light of the kerosene lamp in her room at the end of the hall, and she had sat very still for a very long time. And then she had folded the letter and put it in the false bottom of her traveling trunk, where she also kept the small revolver and 3 months' worth of emergency money. And she had come out to dinner that evening and been perfectly fine. Levi had watched her at dinner that night in that particular way he had, not staring, never obviously staring, just present in a way that felt like attention. And he had asked if she was all right, and she had said yes, and he had said, "You sure?" And she had said, "Of course." And he had said, "Okay," and let it go, because that was what they did. They let each other have their closed doors, and she had been grateful. And also in a way she did not examine, slightly broken by it. Because she was not all right. She was frightened in a way she had not been frightened since the morning she had arrived at the bank to find the board's decision posted on her employment file. And she did not know how long the fear would stay at this level, and she did not know how long she could sustain the performance of calm without eventually fracturing. But she had looked at this man across the dinner table with his careful eyes and his carefully ordinary questions and his deliberate refusal to need anything from anyone, and she had thought, "He cannot know. He has his own weight. He does not need mine on top of it." If he knew she was being hunted, if he knew that her presence on his ranch might attract trouble with actual teeth, he would have every right to send her away, and she could not afford to be sent away. Not yet. Not until she figured out what to do about Gerald Holt. Not until she decided whether she could trust anyone in this town enough to tell them the truth. So she had kept being brave, and he had kept being not lonely. And April had come to Redemption Creek with the quality of a held breath, and everything between them had continued to tighten and clarify in the way that two people who are not talking about the important things will sometimes find that the important things press themselves into every other conversation until the air itself is saturated with unspoken meaning. On the first Thursday of April, they rode together to the south pasture to move a section of fence that a late-season storm had knocked down, and they worked side by side through the morning, and the work was hard and physical and comfortable. And at midday, they sat with their backs against the new fence posts and ate the food she had wrapped in cloth that morning and drank water from the canteen. And the silence was the good kind. And then Levi said, without looking at her, "You haven't asked me anything about my life before Arizona." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Most people ask," he said. "By now they've usually asked. I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know." He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, something stripped of its usual careful management, something that looked almost like gratitude. "There was a woman," he said, and then he stopped. "She waited. In Kansas," he said. "5 years before I came here, she died." He said it plainly without dramatizing it, the way you say a fact that you have lived with long enough that the shape of it has worn smooth. It was a fever. It was fast. We'd been married 14 months. Nora said nothing for a moment, then she said, "I'm sorry. I came here after," he said. "I came here because I needed somewhere that didn't know her. Somewhere I could be a different version of myself without it being a betrayal of who I was before." "Did it work?" she asked. He looked out at the red, flat distance. "Mostly," he said. She thought about the poetry book. She thought about the 30 minutes on the porch every morning. She thought about the careful, constructed fullness of his days. "I think you are allowed to need people," she said, very quietly. And then she was afraid she had said too much, but he did not pull away. He only nodded once, a small motion, like an acknowledgement of something that had been said in a language they were both still learning. She did not tell him about Gerald Holt that day. She told herself she would tell him soon. She did not. Through April and into May, she told herself the same thing daily, a private promise she kept deferring, because every day that nothing happened was a day she could convince herself it was under control, that Gerald Holt had lost interest, that Clara's letter had been the end of it rather than the beginning. Meanwhile, the thing between them grew. It grew quietly and without announcement, in the way that things grow in desert country, where the surface appears dry and fixed, but underneath, the roots are moving through hidden water, patient and certain and unstoppable. It grew in the 30 minutes on the porch before dawn when they sat with their coffee and watched the sky change colors, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. It grew in the evenings when she worked at the table on the accounts, and he read at the other end of the same table, and the lamp threw a circle of warmth around them both. It grew in the particular quality of attention he paid to things she said, the way he would sometimes come back to something she had mentioned 2 days earlier with a question or a thought, as though her words had been sitting with him since she spoke them. It grew in the way she had started to know his moods before he said anything, the particular set of his shoulders when the work had gone badly, the very slight loosening of his face when the day had been good. She had not been in love before. She had been close to it once, with a man in St. Louis who had turned out to be afraid of her competence, which she had found disappointing and ultimately clarifying. But this was different. This was not the combustible, anxious, performing thing she had felt before. This was something quieter and more complete, something that had grown out of shared labor and shared silence, and the particular intimacy of being known by someone in small practical ways before you were known in any other way. She was also terrified of it. She was terrified because she was in this man's house under circumstances she had not fully disclosed, because her presence here was a risk to his safety that she had not had the courage to confess, because every day she did not tell him was another day the foundation of whatever this was had been built on something she was not sure it could hold. In the second week of May, Cisco came to her while Levi was in town for supplies. He came into the kitchen where she was working, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man carrying something he wasn't sure how to put down, and she had looked at him and said, "What is it, Cisco?" "Man in town," Cisco said. "At the Half Moon. Been there 2 days. He's been asking about you, Miss Nora. Asking if anyone knows a woman came from St. Louis, auburn hair, green eyes, good with numbers." The floor tilted slightly under her feet. "What does he look like?" she asked, and her voice was completely steady, which she noted with the distant part of her mind that was always taking notes. Cisco described him. She did not know the man by description, but she knew what he was. He was one of Gerald Holt's people, sent to find her, here in Redemption Creek, in the red throat of the Arizona Canyon where she had thought she was invisible. "Did you say anything?" she asked. "No," Cisco said, with the simple dignity of a young man who had been raised to understand that some questions you don't answer. "I came straight here." She thanked him. She sent him to check the south fence, because she needed him out of the way while she thought. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left, gripping the edge of the table with both hands, and then she went to her room and took the revolver from the false bottom of her trunk and put it in her coat pocket, and then she went out to the barn to saddle her horse. She was going to go to town. She was going to deal with this herself. She was going to find this man before Levi came back, and she was going to make clear, in whatever terms were necessary, that she was not available to be found. This was, in retrospect, not her finest decision. She found the man at the Half Moon Saloon, as Cisco had said. He was a medium-sized man with a forgettable face and the particular look of someone who did jobs professionally, without letting any particular job mean anything to him. He was at the bar with a beer, and when she walked in he looked up and she saw the recognition cross his face, and she knew then that she had made a mistake by coming, because she had just confirmed for him that she was who he was looking for. She put her hand in her coat pocket. He said very quietly, "Mr. Holt just wants to talk." "Gerald Holt can go to hell," she said, also quietly, also very steadily, because she was very good at sounding steadier than she felt. "He says you have documents that belong to him." "I have documentation of what he did," she said. "That's different. Those documents belong to the people whose money he stole. He says if you return what you took and sign a statement that you were mistaken in your interpretation, he'll leave you alone. And if I don't sign it—" The man looked at her with the neutral expression of someone delivering a weather report. "He has people who would be interested in what you've been doing for the last few months. There are laws about fraud in terms of misrepresentation in a marriage arrangement. He could make things difficult for you and for whoever has been harboring you." She felt the cold reach all the way through her. There it was, the trap. It was not just her he was threatening. It was Levi. It was this man who had lost his wife and built a life over the top of his grief, and who had made room for her on his porch and at his table, and who had told her about Kansas because she had not asked, because she had let him tell things in his own time, and she had repaid that gentleness by bringing this into his home. "I need time," she said. "2 days," the man said. She turned and walked out of the saloon. She was halfway to her horse when she heard the door open behind her and heard boots on the saloon steps, and turned to see Levi Haskins standing in the doorway of the Half Moon, looking from her to the man who had followed her out and back to her again. And in his face she saw the exact moment he understood that something had been happening that he did not know about, and she saw the hurt of it, and she saw the way he shut it away, and her heart broke cleanly in two. She had been so careful. She had been so careful to protect him from this, and instead she had brought it directly to him by coming to town herself. "Nora," he said. His voice was the controlled, careful voice. "I can explain," she said. "I'd like that," he said. He looked at the man from Holt's employ who had the good instincts to find his horse and leave without being asked. Then he looked at her again. Inside. And that was how they arrived at the Half Moon Saloon, with her gun out and his jaw tight and the whole weight of the last 4 months pressing down on the space between them. She lowered the gun. She was not a fool. She lowered it and put it back in her coat pocket, and she stood very straight, and she told him everything. She told him about Gerald Holt and the falsified records. She told him about the board of directors and the decision that had gone against her and the quiet, implacable pressure that had come after. She told him about the boarding house in St. Louis in winter, with not enough firewood, and the advertisement in the paper, and the decision to disappear into a different life in a different territory, and the small revolver in the false bottom of her trunk. She told him about Clara's letter. She told him about Cisco's warning. She told him about the man at the bar and the threat he had delivered on behalf of Gerald Holt. She told him about the documents. She explained that she had kept copies of what she had found, that the originals were still in St. Louis, placed with a lawyer she trusted, that she had kept the copies as insurance, that they were currently hidden in the false bottom of her trunk with the money and the gun. She told him all of it without crying, because she had made a decision somewhere around the beginning of this recitation that she would not ask him to manage her emotions along with everything else she was asking him to manage. Levi Haskins stood very still through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Hank Brewster had quietly found a reason to be in the back room. They were effectively alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. It was not quite a question. She had several answers ready. She discarded the defensive ones. "Because I was afraid you'd send me away," she said. "And because I was afraid that knowing would make you a target. And because I am not good at asking people to carry things for me." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not fully read, and then he said, "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met." She said, "I know." He said, "You brought a gun to a confrontation with a professional enforcer by yourself instead of telling me what was happening." She said, "I handled it." "You told him you needed 2 days," he said, "which gives us 2 days to figure out how to make sure Gerald Holt never threatens you or anyone connected to you again, which means you did not entirely handle it." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "Sit down," he said, and his voice had changed, the controlled emptiness gone, replaced by something that was not anger exactly but was related to it, something that was specifically the anger of a person who has been very frightened on someone else's behalf. "Sit down, Nora, and let me think." She sat down. He paced the saloon floor for several minutes, which she had never seen him do before, and she watched him and understood that the pacing was its own form of communication, that he was not cold or distant or pulling away, that he was working, that whatever walls had existed between them an hour ago, she had just walked through them by telling him the truth, and the thing on the other side of those walls was a man who was frightened for her and furious about it and trying to find a solution. She loved him then. She could name it in that moment with complete certainty, sitting on a saloon chair in Redemption Creek watching him pace, and the naming of it was both the most clarifying and the most complicated thing that had happened to her in recent memory. He stopped pacing. "You said the copies are in your trunk," he said. "Yes." "And the originals are with a lawyer in St. Louis." "Yes. A man named Theodore Parks. He's honest." "I believe he would have already made attempts to present the evidence to someone, but without my testimony he may not have gotten far." "What would make the most difference?" Levi said. "Legally, what would make Gerald Holt's position untenable?" She thought about it. "The testimony of someone with direct knowledge who could corroborate the documentation," she said. "Someone from within the bank itself, a teller or a clerk who saw the transfers being made. There was a young woman named Margaret Stiles who worked the deposit counter. She knew what she was doing when she processed those transfers. I always believed she would have spoken if she had felt safe doing so." "Then we need to get word to Theodore Parks," Levi said. "We need him to find Margaret Stiles, and we need to give him enough of what you have to give her legal protection in exchange for testimony." "That could take months," Nora said. "It might," he said. "Right now our immediate problem is the man who will come back in 2 days looking for an answer." He looked at her directly. "I'm going to speak to Sheriff Carver." Nora stiffened. "Carver doesn't have jurisdiction over what happened in Missouri." "No," Levi said, "but he has jurisdiction over a man who was here making threats against a resident of this county, and Carver is honest, which matters. And he has contacts in the U.S. Marshal's office who have jurisdiction over interstate matters." He paused. "You're going to have to trust me on this, Nora. I know that is not something you do easily." The quiet accuracy of that landed in her chest like a stone in still water. "I trust you," she said, and she meant it with a simplicity and completeness that surprised her. Something moved in his face. It was brief, quickly managed, but she saw it. A flash of something that looked like relief and looked like pain simultaneously, like a man who had just been told something he had needed to hear and had not known he needed it. "Good," he said. "Stay here." Sheriff Carver was a big, graying man who had been appointed to his position 4 years ago specifically, because he was the most reliably uncorruptible person in the county, a quality he maintained with almost evangelical dedication. He came back with Levi to the saloon inside of 20 minutes, and listened to Nora's account with the focused attention of a man who was already organizing what she was telling him into categories of actionable and background. And when she was done, he asked 3 precise questions and then said, "I'm going to need you to write down everything you just told me, today." "All right," Nora said, "and I'm going to need those copies from your trunk." She looked at Levi. Levi gave her a very small nod. "All right," she said again. Carver looked at Levi. "The man at the bar is still in town. I'm going to have a conversation with him about his travel plans." "Thank you, James," Levi said. Carver stood up, settled his hat, and looked at Nora with the particular expression of a man who was reserving his feelings about the situation for a more appropriate moment. "Miss Yates," he said, "in the future, if someone is threatening you in this county, I'd appreciate being made aware of it before the situation requires a revolver." "Yes," she said. "I understand." He left. Levi sat down across from her at the saloon table. Hank Brewster had reappeared behind the bar with the good timing of a man who had decided the worst was over, and he brought them both coffee without being asked, which in Nora's experience was the highest form of saloon-keeper hospitality. They sat with their coffee in the quiet of the afternoon. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You owe me honesty," he said, "which you've given me. I'm not interested in apologies." She looked at him across the table. The afternoon light came through the saloon's single window and lay across the table between them in a long amber stripe. "You're not angry," she said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. "I didn't say that," he said, "but you're not sending me away." His eyes met hers across the table, and the stillness in them was not cold and not empty and not the careful management she had come to know. It was something else. It was the stillness of a man who had made a decision so clearly and completely that the decision itself was no longer in question and only the words for it remained. "No," he said, "I'm not sending you away." She looked down at her coffee. "I have my own confession to make," he said. She looked up. "I told you I came here because I needed somewhere that didn't know her," he said, "which is true. But the full truth is that I have been here 6 years. And for most of those 6 years, I have been using busyness as a replacement for everything I told myself I did not need. I told myself I was content. I told myself the ranch was enough, that Pete and Cisco were enough, that the work of the days was enough." He stopped. "And then you stepped off that stage in February and told me you had several questions, and I have not been able to convince myself of any of those things since." She felt the words settle into her like warm water. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "Everything I told you today, I should have told you months ago." "Yes," he said. "And I should have made it clearer, months ago, that you were not a convenient arrangement, that you were considerably more than that." He looked at her steadily. "So we are both guilty of keeping things we should have said." "It seems that way," she said. "I think," he said, "that when this is settled, when Holt is dealt with and you are safe and not carrying this thing alone anymore, I would like to speak to you about something." "What something?" she said. "The 3-month trial period ended in May," he said. "I have been aware of that for 2 weeks. I have not brought it up because I did not know how to raise it without also raising everything that I didn't know how to say." Her heart was doing something remarkable. "You could have asked me to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you now." "To stay," she said. "To stay," he said, "as more than a bookkeeper. As more than a helpmate in the practical sense." He was not a man who spoke easily about these things, and she could see the effort of it in his face, the slight roughness of someone using muscles they had kept carefully unexercised for a long time. "As my wife, if you are willing, properly, not an arrangement, a marriage." She looked at him for a long time. "I have brought you a great deal of trouble," she said. "You have," he said. "I find I don't mind." "I am not always easy to know," she said. "Neither am I," he said. She thought about the 30 minutes on the porch before dawn. She thought about the poetry book. She thought about the morning she had moved the cattle from Mrs. Calloway's garden and heard him laugh, and the way that laugh had done something to the locked and bolted door she kept inside herself. She thought about every morning since, and every evening, and the way the ranch house had started to feel, not like a hiding place, but like a place she was choosing. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the simple physical fact of it, his warm, scarred hand over hers, was the most honest thing that had happened between them in 4 months of careful management. And she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because they did not need to. The next weeks were not simple. Carver had his conversation with Gerald Holt's man, a conversation that apparently involved a very clear description of what would happen if the man was found in the county again, and what would happen to Gerald Holt himself if he attempted to use the threat of fraudulent marriage claims as a weapon against Nora Yates, since the sheriff had a personal relationship with the U.S. Marshal in Tucson and was not disinclined to use it. The man left Redemption Creek. Levi wrote 2 letters, one to Theodore Parks in St. Louis, providing him with a detailed account of Nora's situation and the specific name of Margaret Stiles as a potential witness, along with confirmation that copies of the original documents were in secure possession. The second letter went to the U.S. Marshal's office directly, which Carver countersigned, formally documenting the fraudulent conduct and the interstate nature of the intimidation. It took 6 weeks to hear back. 6 weeks during which Nora continued to keep the ranch accounts and continued to ride the fence lines with Levi on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and continued to sit across from him at the dinner table in the evenings, except that now the evenings were different, because the careful management had been put down, and what was underneath it was allowed to be there, in the small way that 2 private people allow important things to be present, which is to say, carefully, tenderly, but really. He held her hand on the porch one morning while they drank their coffee and watched the sun come up over the canyon rim, and the sunrise was nothing unusual. It happened every day, but the fact of his hand around hers while it happened made the whole ordinary business of it into something she wanted to keep. They talked in the evenings. Real talking, not the practical exchange of daily information, but the kind of talking that happens between people who have decided to know each other, slowly filling in the histories they had kept at distance. She told him about her father and the bookkeeping lessons, about the pleasure she had taken in numbers since she was small, the way a column of figures that balanced felt like a small proof of order in an otherwise disorderly world. He told her more about Kansas, about Sarah, his first wife, not the painful abbreviated version he had given her in the South pasture, but the fuller version, her name and her laughter and the particular way she had of knowing what he was thinking before he said it, and he told it without the armor of self-protection he had worn around it before, and she listened with the full attention she brought to all things that mattered. "You loved her very much," she said. "Yes," he said, "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "That does not change what I feel about you. I want to be clear about that. I spent a long time being afraid that it would, that there was only a certain amount of this in me and that I had used it up. I have discovered that was not accurate." "I'm glad," she said softly. "So am I," he said, and the way he looked at her when he said it was something she thought she could spend a very long time being looked at like. The letter from Theodore Parks arrived on a Thursday in late June. It was a long letter. Parks was a thorough man. He had found Margaret Stiles. She had been dismissed from the bank 2 weeks after Nora had left St. Louis, which Parks believed was not coincidental. She had been living with her sister in a rooming house, and she had been, in Parks's careful legal phrasing, waiting for someone to give her a reason to speak. The copies Nora had provided had given her exactly that reason. She had made a full statement, corroborating the falsified records, providing additional detail that strengthened the evidence considerably. Parks had presented the combined documentation to the federal court in St. Louis. Gerald Holt had been arrested on a Wednesday. He was facing charges of bank fraud, misappropriation of funds, and intimidation of witnesses, the last of which had been added specifically due to the actions in Redemption Creek that Carver had documented. His assets were frozen. His position at the bank was terminated. The board of directors, Parks noted with a dryness that came through even in writing, had issued a statement expressing their profound surprise and distress at this development, which Parks considered approximately as sincere as a carnival barker's promise. Nora read the letter standing at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She folded it and put it down and stood still for a moment, and then she went out to find Levi. He was in the barn, repairing a section of harness with old Pete, and he looked up when she came in and saw something in her face and said, "Pete, give us a minute." And Pete gave them several minutes by removing himself completely from the barn, which was efficient. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up at her. She was smiling, and it was the smile of a woman who has been afraid for a long time and has just had the fear taken away. Not the performance of calm she had been maintaining, but something entirely unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He crossed the distance between them and put his arms around her, and she held on to him with both hands and pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, and it was not the controlled composure she had been practicing for 6 months. It was relief. Real, full bodily relief, the kind that only comes when you finally let yourself feel how frightened you were. He held her until the relief worked its way through. "It's done," she said, against his shoulder. "It's done," he confirmed, and his voice was rough with something he was not going to call by name yet, but which was sitting in his chest with the settled weight of something that had found its place. "I want to stop being afraid," she said. "You were never afraid," he said, and he meant it, not as a performance of the bravery she had been maintaining, but as a true thing, as the recognition that the courage she had shown was real even when the fear behind it was also real. "You were afraid and you were also brave. Both things were true." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "No," he said, "they're not." He tucked a loose strand of her auburn hair back from her face with a gentleness that was entirely without strategy. "I think you have been the bravest person I have known in quite some time. I just also think you didn't have to carry it alone." She held his gaze and thought about the months of managing, of keeping her fear hidden and her composure fixed, and her need for safety disguised as competence. And she thought about how it had felt to finally say all of it in the Half Moon Saloon with the gun still warm in her pocket and him walking toward her. And she thought that the exhaustion of performing safety for another person's comfort was something she was very ready to be done with. "I know that now," she said. He kissed her then, in the quiet of the barn with the smell of hay and leather and old Pete's discreet absence, a straightforward and unhurried kiss that was nothing at all like the careful management of feelings that had preceded it, and everything like the honest acknowledgement of what had grown between them in 4 months of adjacent living. She kissed him back with the same straightforwardness and thought, yes, this is the thing. This is what was on the other side of all those closed doors. They were married in September. It was not a large wedding. It did not need to be. The church in Redemption Creek still leaned slightly to the left and had still not been properly explained. But Pastor Willard had been conducting marriages in it for 11 years and had no complaints. Nora wore the best dress she owned, which was a deep green wool that was not technically a wedding dress but which suited her in a way that a white dress would not have. And she stood in that gently leaning church with Levi beside her in a clean white shirt and dark trousers and the best boots he owned, which she had noticed he had polished himself that morning. And she took his hand and meant every word she said. Old Pete sat in the front pew with his hat in his lap and blinked several times during the vows in a way that he later attributed to dust. Cisco sat beside him and did not attempt to attribute anything to anything, and simply let his face show what his face was showing, which was the straightforward happiness of a young man who liked both of these people very much and was glad they had found each other. Mrs. Calloway was there, of course. Mrs. Calloway was always somewhere things were happening. She sat 3 rows back and watched the proceedings with the expression of a woman, confirming something she had known for some time. Sheriff Carver attended and shook Levi's hand afterward with the warmth of a man who had had opinions about this development for several months and was satisfied to see them vindicated. Hank Brewster at the Half Moon Saloon gave them a bottle of his best whiskey with a note that said, "Congratulations on your marriage, and also on not shooting anyone in my establishment." They held a small dinner at the ranch after, with Pete and Cisco and Pastor Willard and Mrs. Calloway and Sheriff Carver and 3 neighboring ranching families who had come to know Nora over the course of the year, and who arrived with food and goodwill, and the particular celebratory energy of a frontier community that knew how to make an occasion out of the good things when they came. It was a very good evening. After everyone had gone, Nora stood on the front porch in the September night air and looked at the sky above the canyon, which was remarkable, which was always remarkable out here in the way that city skies never were, thick and bright with stars and the dense shadow of the canyon walls cutting upward at the edges. She had her arms folded against the chill, and she was thinking about her father, about how much he would have liked this place and this man and this life, about how he had always said that the best thing a person could do for themselves was find where they were most useful and stay there. She heard the door open behind her, and then Levi's arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and he was warm and solid and real, and she thought, "I am most useful here. I am most myself here. Whatever I was running from brought me to where I was supposed to be." "What are you thinking about?" he said. "My father," she said. "He would have liked you." "I hope so," he said. "I would have liked to know him." She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. "He always said you know a person by how they treat the people they don't have to be kind to, by how they treat people who can't give them anything back." She paused. "You paid for Cisco to see the doctor in Tucson last November and you never told a soul." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know that?" "The receipt was in the discretionary account," she said, "which I created, so I saw everything that went into it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. "That's a very small thing," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, into her hair, and they stood on the porch in the September night looking at the extraordinary desert sky, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the canyon was vast and red and ancient, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The first year of their marriage was the best year of Nora's life. She said this to him once, on a winter evening when they were both reading by the fire, and he had looked up from his book and said, "Mine too," so simply and completely that she had felt it in her bones. She continued to keep the ranch accounts, but she expanded her work over the course of that first year, taking on the accounts for 2 neighboring ranches whose bookkeeping was in the same chaotic state Levi's had been in when she arrived, which gave her a satisfying professional purpose and a modest additional income that she put toward the ranch's improvement fund. She had ideas about the ranch, about expanding the cattle operation, and eventually adding a small breeding program for horses, which were ideas that Levi received with the open and genuine interest of a man who respected her intelligence and also happened to agree with most of her conclusions. She also, in the autumn of their first married year, received a letter from Theodore Parks in St. Louis. The trial had concluded. Gerald Holt had been found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The bank had been placed under new management and was in the process of restituting the accounts he had falsified. Margaret Stiles had been offered a position at a different bank, which she had accepted. Parks, in his dry and thorough way, expressed his satisfaction with the outcome and his continued respect for Miss Yates' courage in initiating the process. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table and felt the last of the held fear dissolve. Not the immediate fear that had been resolved in June, but the older, deeper fear. The fear she had been carrying since the day she had walked into that board meeting and been turned against. The fear that had said your honesty will cost you everything. She felt it dissolve and felt herself take a full breath in its place. She wrote back to Theodore Parks and thanked him for everything. She also sent a letter to Margaret Stiles, whom she had never met but felt she knew in the way you know someone who has been afraid of the same things you were afraid of, and found the same courage you found. She told Margaret Stiles that she was grateful, that she hoped the new position was a good one, and that she wished her every good thing. Margaret Stiles wrote back. They would correspond for years. In the spring of their second year, Nora told Levi she was expecting their first child. She told him in the evening after dinner, when the dishes were cleared and he was at the table with the cattle breeding records she had organized for him, and she sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something," and the quality of her voice made him put the records down immediately. She told him. The expression that moved across his face was one of the most complete things she had ever seen from him, a man who kept so much controlled in his face, and this broke through entirely, shock and joy and something that was almost pain in the way of very large joy, and he sat looking at her for a moment without speaking, and then he stood up and came around the table and pulled her gently upright and held her, and she felt him breathe, one deep shaky breath. Like a man who has just understood the full weight of what he has been given. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "I'm very well, in fact." "Good," he said. "That's good." He pulled back and looked at her face and then held her again, and she laughed a little at his thoroughness, and he said, "I'm allowed to hold on," and she said, "Yes, you are." Their son was born in December of 1883, a cold and clear December morning when the canyon held the night frost longer than usual, and the ranch was very still and white in the early hours. He came into the world without excessive drama, which seemed like a good start, and he was healthy and large and entirely present. And when the midwife placed him in Levi's arms, Levi stood very still and looked at this person, this new and complete person, and Nora watched from the bed and felt something so enormous she couldn't name it properly. They named him Thomas after her father, Thomas Haskins. Old Pete, when he was brought in to meet Thomas for the first time, held the baby with the extremely careful posture of a man who had not held a baby in decades and was aware this was a significant responsibility, and he said, "He looks like you, Miss Nora," and then thought about it and said, "And also like you, boss," which seemed diplomatically correct and was received as such. Cisco was 21 by then, and had the extremely enthusiastic response of a young man for whom this was entirely new territory, and he held the baby for approximately 4 minutes before growing visibly nervous and handing him back, and he said Thomas was the finest baby he had ever seen, and when pressed admitted that Thomas was the only baby he had ever held, and this did not appear to undermine his confidence in his assessment. Thomas was a good baby. He was a curious, watchful baby, with green eyes that eventually settled into a shade between Nora's and the dark of Levi's, and he had a quality of attention from very early on that made the people around him feel noticed, which seemed a reasonable thing to inherit. Levi was a father the way he was everything else, present and steady and consistent, getting up in the dark nights without complaint, learning the particular vocabularies of this small person with the same patient attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Nora watched him with Thomas and felt the same thing she had felt watching him be quietly kind to Cisco, the same thing that had told her, long before she was willing to say it, that this was a man of real quality. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, through the accumulation of good decisions and hard work, and two people who each brought different but complementary strengths to the project of building something lasting. The horse breeding program Nora had proposed proved to be their best decision. Begun in 1884 with 2 good mares and 1 exceptional stallion purchased at considerable expense from a ranch near Tucson, and producing within 3 years a consistent line of working horses that sold well across the territory. In 1885, they hired an additional hand, a serious young Tohono O'odham man named Raphael who had been working seasonal cattle work around the county, and who came to the Haskins ranch on a recommendation from a neighboring rancher and stayed, because Levi Haskins was one of the few ranch operators in the region who paid consistently, treated his hands honestly, and did not operate with the kind of brutal assumptions about indigenous workers that the territory was unfortunately thick with. Nora made sure Raphael was included in the ranch dinners she had started hosting on Sunday evenings, which had become something of a tradition, and she and Levi both made clear that his position was the same as Pete's and Cisco's, which was to say a real one, with real regard. Raphael was quiet and exceptionally skilled with horses, and the horse breeding program entered a new phase of quality under the combination of his knowledge and Nora's organizational management and Levi's instinct for bloodlines. In 1886, their second son was born in July. They named him Daniel. He was louder than Thomas had been as a baby, more immediately expressive, quick to laugh and quick to complain, and entirely himself from the first day. Thomas was 2.5 and received his brother with the solemn assessment of a small person doing serious evaluation, and eventually declared him acceptable, and the two of them over the following years developed the particular alliance of brothers who are different enough to complement each other and close enough in age to be constant company. Cisco, by 1886, had saved enough money to lease a small piece of land east of town, which he was beginning to develop into his own operation. He still came to Sunday dinners regularly. He still called Levi boss, with an affection that had nothing to do with employment anymore, and everything to do with what the man had meant to him during the years he had been young and far from home and uncertain. He called Nora Miss Nora, regardless of how many times she asked him not to, and she had stopped asking and had come to find it sweet. Old Pete turned 60 in 1886 and showed no signs of reducing his workload, which Nora monitored with careful attention and occasional interference, bringing extra food to the bunkhouse when the winter was hard, and making sure he saw the doctor when she had reason to suspect his knee was worse than he was admitting. Pete accepted this care with the gruff, slightly embarrassed dignity of a man who had not been looked after by anyone for a very long time and was not entirely sure how to receive it. The marriage between Nora and Levi continued to be the kind of marriage that makes both people better at being themselves. It was not without friction. They were both strong-willed people with specific ideas about how things should be done, and there were disagreements about the ranch and about money and about a few decisions that took real negotiation to resolve, and those negotiations were occasionally heated, because both of them had opinions and both of them expressed them. But the fighting, such as it was fair. They did not use the closed doors against each other. They did not weaponize what they knew. They had established, somewhere in the process of being honest with each other in the Half Moon Saloon with the gun in her pocket, that honesty was the foundation, and they maintained it. In 1888, on a May afternoon that was almost identical in quality to the afternoons 4 years earlier, when they had first got the rhythm of working together, Levi and Nora rode out together to check the far fence line, the same fence they had repaired together before he told her about Kansas, and they sat in the same position with their backs against the posts and ate the food she had wrapped in cloth and drank water from the canteen, and the silence was the same kind of good silence. Except that Thomas and Daniel were back at the ranch with old Pete, and the world had a different shape than it had had the last time they had sat in this spot. "I've been thinking," Nora said. "Tell me," he said. "The school in Redemption Creek is terrible," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Mrs. Hendricks is not incompetent, but she's working with essentially no resources and no support from the county," Nora said. "And Thomas is going to be of school age next year, and Daniel the year after, and I would like their education to be better than what is currently available." "What are you proposing?" Levi said, with the tone of a man who had come to recognize when Nora was at the beginning of an idea that was going to require both of them. "I want to talk to a few of the other ranching families about pooling resources," she said. "If we could get 4 or 5 families together, we could hire a proper teacher, someone trained from back east, and we could build a small school room that isn't the back of Mrs. Calloway's store. Levi was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Calloway would have something to say about that. Mrs. Calloway would be part of the conversation, Nora said. She has opinions about everything, but she also has resources, and she genuinely cares about the children in this town. This is going to be a significant project, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his clearest expression, the one that was entirely without strategy, just him, seeing her, meaning what his face was saying. It's a good idea, he said. Let's do it. The Redemption Creek Schoolhouse was completed in the autumn of 1889. It was a small building, but it was solid and properly built, with real glass windows, which Mrs. Calloway had insisted upon and partially financed, and 4 rows of desks, and a proper blackboard, and a young woman named Miss Helen Price who had been trained at a normal school in Ohio, and had come west because she wanted to, and who proved to be exactly the kind of teacher that the town needed. Thomas Haskins started school in September of 1889 and came home on the first day with the look of a person who has found their natural territory. Daniel started the following year with considerably more noise about the process and the same eventual satisfaction. Nora served on the school committee for the next 10 years, and in that capacity had more pointed arguments with more people about the appropriate funding and curriculum of a frontier school than she had had about anything else in her life, and she won most of them, which she found extremely satisfying. In 1890, Nora discovered she was expecting again, their 3rd child. She told Levi in the same kitchen, at the same table, though now the table was larger and the kitchen had been expanded, and Thomas's drawings were pinned to the wall above the bread crock. The expression on his face was the same one it had been the first time, that complete breaking through of joy, a little less shocked this time, no less real. Their daughter was born in February of 1891. She was small and dark-haired, and had her father's eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about what she wanted. They named her Clara, after the woman enceinte. Louis, who had written the careful letter in time to warn Nora of the danger, the woman whose honesty under pressure had been a small act of courage that Nora had never forgotten. Levi held Clara on the first evening and sat with her by the fire while Nora rested, and Thomas and Daniel sat on either side of him, and old Pete was in the corner chair he had occupied so many evenings, and the lamp threw the same warm circle, and Nora, waking from a light sleep to find this scene arranged in the firelight, felt the fullness of it so completely that she closed her eyes again and simply let it be inside her. The years continued. Clara grew into a person of devastating certainty and frequent opinions, which her brothers found alternately aggravating and admirable, and which her parents found extremely familiar. She could ride before she was 5, which Thomas had done at the same age, and she had Nora's gift for numbers and Levi's gift for silence, the particular silence of a person who is paying complete attention, and she was at 8 years old the most interesting person in any room she entered, which the schoolroom was not always fully prepared for, but Miss Price handled with consistent good humor. Thomas, as he grew, became more and more the person he had suggested he would be, a young man of quiet observation and serious purpose, who helped on the ranch with the same methodical competence that had characterized him as a small child evaluating his baby brother, and who had by 15 a broader reading life than most adults in the county, and a way of asking questions that got to the center of things very directly. Daniel was everything that Thomas was not in the specific way of complementary siblings, outward where Thomas was inward, immediate where Thomas was long-term, with a gift for fixing mechanical things and a laugh that could fill the whole south pasture. And when he was not on the ranch, he was in town with the other young men of his generation, who all appeared to find him gravitational. Old Pete died in 1895, quietly in the bunkhouse in his sleep, on a cold January night. They buried him on the ranch, on the small rise above the south pasture where the fence line ran. Levi said a few words at the burial and was unable to finish them, and Nora stood beside him and held his hand, and did not try to manage the moment, just stood there with him in it. Pete had been here before Nora had come, and he had watched what she and Levi built with what she had always suspected was a satisfaction he would have been embarrassed to name. Raphael stayed on and became over time not just an employee, but a genuine part of the ranch's identity. His knowledge of the land and the horses something that the Haskins operation built itself around. And when Cisco's small ranch east of town began to grow, it was Raphael who helped him think through the horse side of his operation, and the connection between the two ranches became one of the things that made Redemption Creek a better community. Cisco married in 1893 a woman named Lucia who was from a ranching family in the county and who shared Cisco's relentless cheerfulness and added to it a formidable practical intelligence. Nora liked her immediately. They became friends in the direct way of women who recognize each other's strengths. Cisco and Lucia had a son in 1894, and Levi stood as godfather, which he did with the slightly overwhelmed dignity of a man who had not expected his life to expand in quite these directions, but was not sorry that it had. The territory of Arizona approached statehood. The town of Redemption Creek grew. New families arrived. New buildings went up on the main street. The lien of the church was eventually addressed in 1897 by a structural repair that Pastor Willard's successor oversaw. And the Half Moon Saloon, which had been present at the beginning of the most important conversation of Nora and Levi's life, continued to operate as a place where the business of the community was conducted between the hours of noon and midnight. Hank Brewster retired in 1896. Before he did, he wrote a short note to Nora and Levi that said simply, "It has been a pleasure to watch what you built." He said nothing about the gun. In 1898, Levi and Nora rode together to the south pasture on a May afternoon that was warm and clear, and held the particular quality of a day that knows it is being appreciated. They did not need to go out for any specific reason. The fence was in good condition. The cattle were fine, but they had developed over the years a habit of riding out together when the day allowed it, partly practical, partly because the land was theirs and they liked to be in it together. They sat against the fence posts. Nora ate the food she had wrapped in cloth. Levi drank from the canteen and looked out at the red flat distance that he had looked at 16 years earlier when he had said the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a long time. He was 48. She was 42. The gray in his dark hair had been there for several years, and she had loved it from the first strand. She had some herself coming in at her temples, and he had told her once very seriously that he found it beautiful, and she had told him that was very convenient, and he had said, "Yes, it is." "Do you remember," she said, "the first time we sat here?" "Yes," he said. "You told me about Sarah," she said. "I did," he said. "I didn't tell you anything," she said. "In return, I had several things I could have told you and I didn't tell you any of them." "I know," he said. "I was afraid," she said. "I know," he said again, but he said it without the old careful management, said it with the ease of a man speaking about something that had been understood for a very long time. "And I let you keep it because I was afraid too." "Of what?" she asked. "Of needing someone," he said. "Of admitting it. Of being the version of myself that needed instead of the version that was entirely functional without it." He looked at her with the clear eyes she had looked at across 1,000 mornings and evenings and meals and ordinary working days and extraordinary ones. "You changed that. You changed it just by being here, by not asking what I was before I was ready to say. You changed it too," she said. "You changed what it cost me to be afraid. You made it possible to be afraid and also brave, because you never treated the bravery like it was the only thing I was allowed to be." He reached over and took her hand. They sat in the May afternoon with their backs against the fence they had built together, and their hands together, and the canyon spreading red and vast around them. And Nora thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in February with her hand out for a business handshake, and her heart locked behind a bolted door, and her father's revolver in the false bottom of her trunk. And she thought about the man who had met her with careful dark eyes, and a mouth full of practical questions, and a loneliness he had decided so firmly not to have that he had almost convinced himself. She thought about how they had both been performing something, she performing bravery and he performing contentment, and how the performances had held long enough for the real things underneath to grow large enough to survive being seen. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The afternoon light moved over the red land. A hawk crossed the sky above the canyon rim. The horses stood patient and warm behind them. Somewhere back at the ranch, Thomas was helping Raphael with the horses, and Daniel was probably in town, and Clara was almost certainly reading something she was not supposed to have got to yet on account of her age, and the ranch was going on the way the ranch went on, the work and the life of it continuing as steadily as the river continued when it remembered to visit. They did not need to say what they were thinking. They had never needed to say most of what they knew about each other. They had learned each other in the language before language, in shared mornings and shared labor and shared silence and shared honesty, and everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that did not need saying was here in the May afternoon, in the way his hand felt in hers, in the way the canyon held them both. She was not afraid. He was not lonely. And after all the years and all the careful management and all the heavy things set down, and all the closed doors opened, and all the truths spoken into lamplight, and all the mornings on the porch, and all the evenings at the table, and all the children and all the work, and all the ordinary extraordinary business of a life built together in the red dust of the Arizona territory, neither of those things had ever been the whole truth about either of them. She had been brave and afraid at once. He had been solitary and longing at once, and they had let each other be complicated and real and known, and that had been the whole thing. That had been the entire secret of it. Not the absence of fear or need, but the presence of someone who stayed anyway, who held your hand in the dust beside the fence, who made room on the porch, who laughed when you moved someone else's cattle with the assurance of a person who had absolutely not spent 15 years in an accounting office. Nora leaned her head against Levi's shoulder. Levi rested his cheek against the top of her head. The hawk turned above the canyon on the warm May air. The afternoon held them both.